interesting one. One of the things that's just sprung to mind is we were just having a chat earlier about there's a shift in government strategy in the UK at the moment. So there's a new big strategic paper put out saying government's now going to value sport differently and therefore invest in sport differently based on this stuff.
Okay.
And the stuff is essentially, we're no longer just going to make decisions based on participation numbers or based on success at the top level. We're going to base it on these 5 things, and the 5 things are quite interesting things. Physical well-being,
Yep.
mental well-being, personal development, social and community development, and economic development.
Oh.
Which is a fantastic shift. What's going to be interesting is to see whether that shift in affordance actually moves all the big, wieldy, traditional organisations to somewhere more productive. But it's a really interesting shift in philosophy, which immediately gets to some of those questions about, well, are you supporting my physical well-being and my personal development by getting me to clock up 10,000 hours from the day I walk into a football academy at 12-year-old or whatever it is?
Yeah. Yeah, that's nice. It's really nice to hear that there's changes like that. Really nice.
But it's interesting because for me that's a systemic level affordance, but of course that's not going to change the culture, it's not going to change the tradition, it's not going to change the economic incentive that, for example, a football academy has to develop and sell players. There's lots of other things that need to change. But I think the interesting thing for me is you were talking earlier about just that notion that wider society needs to shift in its dynamics to enable some of the shifts we'd like to see in sport. If we're true to the philosophy of an ecological dynamic, then there's no systemic strategic plan to move to a new way of being, because that would be entirely at odds with an ecological view of what's happening. What we need to do is just do lots of small-scale stuff that, if it's worth its salt, will amplify into large-scale stuff.
Yeah, but I suppose from like a perspective of some of Snowden's stuff and complex adaptive systems, it'd be recognizing like the weak signals, or things like that, or recognizing things in the wider, things that have come to be in the wider culture, and going, well, we need to dampen that, and recognizing new and emerging things, and go, well, we need to amplify that, which I suppose, that would be my way of understanding where we, or how we action from critically reflecting on the wider society.
Yeah,
I think it's going to be really interesting how those 5 outcomes, if you like, or focus areas interact with the current power dynamics.
Yeah.
So that's what I've been just learning, for me, and my eyes being open really as well in the last few years, is when does something get accepted or rejected? When does novelty happen? When does change happen? Well, it seems that, does it disturb the current balance of power, if you like? If it doesn't, if it goes with it, it tends to get accepted fairly quickly. It's when it challenges the current power status that's where you get a hell of a lot of resistance, but also a lot of behaviour that goes on to maintain that power balance. And I think you've only got to see over in the States at the moment, don't you, with the gun laws and certain politicians supporting basically that, and just those dynamics. I don't it gets as close to literally being about life or death, and yet power seemingly is still more important than life or death. And so if you equate something back to sport, where those outcomes aren't life or death, I think you even more so just going to battle against those power dynamics.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I watched that when you mention power dynamics, for some reason it always brings to mind like masculinity and like the ideas around the patriarchy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I watched a really, really interesting documentary recently called The Mask We Live In, and it was basically all about like masculinity and the problem that masculinity causes around the world. And it was a really it's available on Netflix. It's an excellent documentary. I'd highly recommend it. And like I came away from it going like, you know, the dominant sociocultural constraint we have at the moment is our ideas around masculinity. Like it seems to feed into, at different levels, it feeds into everything, and in a lot of ways it's the source of many of our like biggest problems. So yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I've talked about this before. Like I think, you know, imagine a world run on values that are traditionally feminine versus a world run on values that are traditionally like masculine. It's like kind of chalk and cheese, and it's going. I think what we're looking for is cultures and organizations and leadership that is more classically feminine, more about nurturing, compassion, empathy, whereas unfortunately the world, being patriarchy, is still run on values that are far more like synonymous with masculinity and power and control and things like that. So it's really interesting to reflect on that, and it's also massively interesting because it's the thing that this documentary does so well is it highlights the stories of the young men. And yes, it highlights how detrimental masculinity is for females and, you know, for kids and females as well, massively. But it highlights it through the stories of young men, and it just shows how like trying to conform to these ideas of what masculinity is so damaging on so many levels. So yeah, I think the power dynamics are so important, but they can like massively complex.
And it probably links back full circle to what you're saying earlier, Jimmy, about the, you know, with Maria and creating sort of an open, vulnerable dialogue. That I think, and why it does or doesn't happen, I think that is closely linked to these ideas of masculinity, isn't it? As in, we're not meant to be vulnerable. We're meant to, you know, to have the armor on at all times, aren't we?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point.